So I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders past and present. At Evidence for Learning, we also accept the invitation in the Uluru Statement from the Heart to walk together with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. Tonight I'm on WODONGA land in Melbourne, and I want to specifically pay respect to their elders. This photo is of a significant place of country in inner city Melbourne near where I live. It's the confluence of the Mary Creek and the Yarra River, and it was an important camping and ceremonial area for the WODONGA and Bunurong people, an important source of water and food, and was also the site of an Aboriginal school in the 1800s. So I thought it would be an appropriate piece of country to acknowledge this evening. So welcome again. In tonight's sessions, we're going to explore the key findings of a systematic literature review on the predictors of disengagement. We're going to hear from 6 school leaders about the data and processes that their schools used during the 2020 school year to identify students at risk of disengagement. And we're going to reflect with these leaders about what supports they provided to students during this year to take a preventative approach to disengagement. So an incredible panel of school leaders tonight includes Trish Bullis, who is the Assistant Principal of Seymour College, which is a Peter 12 school in regional Victoria. Donna Gerritz, the Assistant Principal of Western Port Secondary College, a bit closer to Melbourne. Gail Hardman, the Principal of Seymour College. Jodie Parsons, the Assistant Principal of Sunshine College. Michael Rosenbrock, who's the Assistant Principal of WODONGA Senior Secondary College, which is another regional school, and Frank Vittieri, who's the Executive Principal of Footscray High School here in Melbourne. So if you haven't already done so, you've just joined us, please introduce yourself in the chat box. We're also joined this evening by my colleague Susanna Schofel, who's an Assistant Director at Evidence for Learning. So let's get into it. So in 2018, approximately 17% of Australian students were not retained from Year 10 to Year 12, and about 70,000 students did not attain a Year 12 certificate or equivalent. The impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic increased the risk of more students disengaging from school and not completing their school education. And you'll see there some recent headlines out of New South Wales about students who are not returning to school after lockdown. In 2018, Evidence for Learning partnered with Monash University and the Bastow Institute of Professional Leadership, which is part of the Victorian Department of Education and Training, to understand the evidence and practical insights on students at risk of disengaging from school. In 2020, we revisited this work in the context of COVID-19 and the phases of remote and flexible learning and their transition and adaptation back to school sites, so the return to school. The idea behind the work is that the more we understand about disengagement, both the indicators and the possible interventions, the more students can re-engage in their education to help improve their education and wellbeing outcomes. So what do we mean when we say disengagement from school? Well, here's the Victorian Department of Education and Training's definition. It involves a set of interrelated factors rather than a set state of being. The Victorian Department defines it in relation to participation, belonging, and investment in learning. When we talk to a lot of the educators as part of this project, there's a bit of a blurred line between disengaged and at risk of disengaging, but a general rule of thumb is if you're at risk of disengaging, you are still attending school in some form. Now, to get us started, we're going to do a bit of an interactive poll. There's fairly good global evidence and local evidence on the predictors of disengagement from school, but rather than present the findings to you of the systematic literature review, we thought we'd find out what you thought and what you already knew. So the questions are on what you think the evidence says. So not what you think might be the predictors of disengagement, but what you think is captured in the evidence. So answer each question true, false, or unknown based on that. I'll give you a few moments. There's 4 true, false, or unknown questions. Unknown means we don't have enough evidence yet to say. Excellent. I can see a few responses rolling in. We'll give it a couple more minutes. It's going pretty well so far, I must say. I'll give you 30 more seconds to get the last minute answers in. I can see a few people are still putting their responses in. Don't be shy. We can't tell the individual results, so we won't know. We'll share the accumulated results in a minute. Okay, I can't see any more rolling in, so we might end the polling now. So here's the results. The first statement about evidence about academic performance is a strong predictor of leaving school early is true, and that was the most popular choice. The next one is also true. That's fairly common sense in terms of suspensions and expulsions decrease the chances of Year 12 attainment. Most people agreed. The next one on cognitive disengagement is probably true, especially all the people we interviewed for the project, but we just don't have enough evidence to say it emphatically yet. And that's probably because cognitive engagement or disengagement is harder to measure than some other forms of engagement and things like academic outcomes. And the final one about socioeconomic status, it's actually false. Which is not what most people think. The situation with the student results is the socioeconomic status it isn't stronger than academic performance and student behaviour. So you might know a student, for example, who kind of defies the odds of their circumstances they're in. So it is still a predictor, but it's just not stronger than academic performance and student behaviour. So the last one is the trickiest question. So the COVID-19 pandemic increases the risk of disengagement from school for some students due to the challenges in learning from home, health and wellbeing factors, and potential learning losses and risks associated with the transition back to school. A child's experience during the COVID phases is made up of different factors based on their own personal circumstances, and some, as you'll hear from some of our school leaders, might have done better in remote and flexible learning. But we know that COVID-19 has had an impact on mental health from some of the surveys of secondary school students, and we know that some students don't have an ideal home learning situation. And we also know that family violence and adult mental health issues increased during the time, and we expect there's going to be significant impacts on employment going forward. Not only that, we're coming off the back of an awful year of bushfires in Australia. So this not only affects the context of the students, but also the educators working with them. So now let's turn to our panel of school leaders and discuss what they did this year, given that context. And I should mention, I forgot to mention the findings of the literature review. If you want to read a little bit more about it, I'll share the link later this evening. So you can go and read a little bit more detail and context about all the predictors of disengagement and what the current state of the evidence is for each one. So, but before I talk any more about the literature review, I'll turn to our panel of school leaders. To give you a bit of background, all the schools in the project had an ICSIA rating below average. Their average attendance was between 85 and 90%. All these schools do an incredible job at taking a proactive approach to disengagement. And while they do things in different ways to suit their own unique context and the student needs that they serve, what they have in common is they all have a systematic process to identify and take action for students at risk of disengagement. So all these schools had this systematic process in place before COVID, but because they had such robust processes in place, it made the adaptation to identify and taking action for disengagement during remote and flexible learning and the transition back to school sites much easier. So, Michael, I'll start with you. You're the assistant principal at WODONGA Senior Secondary College. It's a year 10 to 12 school in regional Victoria with about 814 students. Most of your students had devices for learning from home. So let's start the conversation by talking about identification of students at risk of disengagement during remote and flexible learning. So do you want to describe what Wodonga Senior Secondary did in terms of learning analytics to help identify those students who might be at risk of disengagement during the home learning phase?
Thanks, Danielle. Yes, we put quite a few things in place. And as we transitioned to remote learning, we collected data from all of our students from what we call their graduate program teacher, which is like a pastoral care teacher, on their access to their internet and any other issues that could be barriers to learning. So before we made that transition, we had a clear idea which students might need some support in terms of their access to technology. And then in terms of actual use of tech, we had an established learning management system we've been using for some time with very clear expectations around how things are to be documented and used. So we continued to use that as we went into remote learning. And because we had all our students online, essentially, almost immediately, we were able to use our analytics in there to see which students were engaging and to therefore follow up where necessary. And we also did some tracking on access to MS Teams, which is what we use for our video conferencing and online comms platform, I guess. So we could track that really closely, and we could see that we were getting really strong engagement and through the times in the day as well. So we could see that we were getting engagement throughout the day and throughout all the lessons, and continued to look at that as we went on. So that data that we had from the very beginning gave us a really clear indication that our students were able to access, things were going well, and they were able to access our curriculum. And it really does come down to, as you alluded earlier, to having things in place. Like, we already had a lot of stuff in place in terms of processes and systems, and we really just adjusted those for remote learning.
Fantastic. I think you took advantage of the opportunity that remote learning presented to be able to collect a lot more analytics. And I also noted, and this is captured in the paper, that in addition, like, it increased by 5 times the frequency of student engagement and wellbeing statistics collected during the period, which is a testament to your hardworking staff. So it's just incredible.
Thank you.
So let's stay in regional Victoria and talk about what Seymour College did during remote learning to identify students at risk of disengagement. So Seymour College is a P-12 school in regional Victoria, about 736 students. Many didn't have access to devices during remote learning. So I think the school predominantly uses take-home packs, hard copy packs. So really different situation to Wodonga. Trish, can you describe Seymour College's absence tracking process during remote learning, of which we're sharing a process map of on the slide at the moment?
Yes, thanks, Danielle. The slide that you're seeing there is about the primary school, but we duplicated that further up the school in a 7 to 10 and 11 and 12. We just tweaked it a little bit for our teachers. One of the things I think when I'm reflecting on it is that this framework came from to make sure that our teachers were feeling comfortable, that when they were ringing home and the families didn't pick up the phone, that they could also see a system where the families would be followed up. So we worked on the premise that if the parent didn't pick up the phone, then there was an attendance tracking system put in place. If they didn't pick up the phone on a day-by-day basis, we escalated who was calling. So we escalated that to the campus manager and also to our wellbeing officer. So you'll see on there a wellbeing referral. That's the system that we had in place prior to COVID, but we actually allowed more teachers to make wellbeing referrals. This is on Compass, school manager. And as the days went on, if the campus manager wasn't successful, the wellbeing officer would kick in. If family care were on board or child protection, then we sort of contacted those systems as well. The endpoint there around our attendance, and it might sound a bit extreme, is that we have a really good Victorian police. And we'd also put in a wellbeing request. So the Vic Police would go to the house and say, hey, the school's been trying to ring you for a few days. Could you please contact the school? And without fail, we would get contact. The bottom line is that the parents, often it was around, I've changed my phone number, we've been out of town, you know, there was lots of reasons why they weren't contacting the school. So we used attendance to underlie, it's sort of the underlying factor around our wellbeing program and linking that in.
I love how comprehensive it was and systematic it was, the approach, and I know you put an incredible amount of work into it. So it's fantastic that every single absence is followed up. Now we'll return closer to an urban area, but not quite Melbourne. Western Port Secondary College caters to about 590 students and had a fairly large number of students that needed devices. I know you guys went above and beyond to secure devices for your students. Donna, do you want to describe Western Port Secondary's triage traffic light system, which we're sharing on the screen now? This was used to identify students at risk of disengagement during the remote learning period.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Danielle. I think what's probably best to know is that Western Port already had a fairly strong identification process in place before COVID hit, but it was pretty traditional in its approach. So we track students to determine their risk factors and disengagement using attendance tracking through ES staff and coordinators. We track the academic tracking through our school leaders in each year level, and then we had our wellbeing team who looked after the referrals and the external supports and the wellbeing tracking. So that's probably not much different than what most schools would currently be doing or would be working through. But during remote learning, we determined that those three groups might really struggle to work collaboratively, and they might end up working in isolation or doubling up on supports. So we kind of needed a way to anchor those supports together to look a bit more holistically at the students while they were online. And we introduced a home group structure, which we hadn't had before. So the home group structure was set vertically from year 7 through to year 11. The aim was to try and keep siblings together in the same group and families together, and try and also reduce those ICT demands because we didn't have a one-to-one device for every student at the beginning of the pandemic. We also attempted to put teachers who already had a strong relationship with our most vulnerable families, which we know quite well. We tried to link them really purposefully. And then our home group teachers used the data from those three bodies and then their daily contact that they're having with those students and families to make a recommendation, which is what we called a vulnerability identification category rating. And what that really meant is in a nutshell is that we were attempting to triage or traffic light our least vulnerable students to our most vulnerable students. And you can see that on the scale on the screen. And what that meant is our youth commitment team was allocated case managers for any students who rated a 2 or above. Now, typically youth commitment didn't look after students that were anything less than a level 3, but it was determined in remote learning that level 2 students might need supports that couldn't be managed as easily with those pre-existing teams, or that they're actually falling through the cracks a little bit quicker than expected. And so we didn't want that. We didn't want anyone to fall through those cracks. The youth commitment case managers are members of the principal class, so myself and the rest of the PRIN team. They're experienced leaders or they're a member of the wellbeing team. And we work in consultation with year level teams, but we case manage those once they're a level 2 or a level 3. And so the case managers are really responsible for those explicit actions and responses and outcomes. And we're kind of the linchpin, if you like, I guess, to ensure that those appropriate actions are taken in relation to deep policy and that no student is left behind. So in a nutshell, that's our process.
Fantastic. I've always liked Western Port's commitment to using data in such a comprehensive way. And I think it's a really good illustration of how you adapted your process that you had in place prior to COVID to this year and built upon it. Okay, so let's now talk about the return to school sites. So what's happened more recently in Victoria and a little bit earlier in other parts of the country, but as I'm based in Melbourne, we won't talk about that. But let's stay on identifying students at risk of disengagement. and start with Footscray High. So Footscray is a new school located in Melbourne. There's about nearly 1,500 students, and it's a one-to-one school, so no students needed devices. Now, Frank, I know Footscray High had strong engagement with families and students during remote learning. The staff used their knowledge of at-risk students and families, and the welfare team did frequent checks with students. But what happened on the return to school sites in relation to identifying students who might be at risk of disengagement? Did you have any concerns around specific groups of students? I know we talked about international students last time we spoke. Can you tell us a little bit about what that looked like?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And congratulations, everyone. It just exemplifies how wonderful the education world has been in our agility to meet the needs of students. So kudos to everyone. So we were new, and we were a merger of two schools, and right in downtown Footscray. And we had so many pivots, as we talk about frequently during COVID. So a year 7 cohort, which was in a different campus to our year 8s to 12s. So during the return, we had a number of major considerations and concerns. And we had a number of students, for those who are outside of Victoria, we had housing estates, which were completely locked down for a period of time. So we had students and families that resided in the housing estates, and they were of major concern around their mental health, access to technology, even though we're one-to-one, internet resources. We have almost 100 international students who families who sent their children abroad to experience life and were caught in a pandemic and didn't have the connection and the family support. And then we also had, as other schools have spoken about, the identification during remote through daily check-ins of students and families. And I suppose that's the biggest point that I want to make, is that the impact on individual families as first teachers in some instance that were struggling, so that support coming back. So that awareness, I suppose if I had to capture what we did, and that is calling or rallying the troops, our workforce around, that's our key responsibility. We as a school can't have a direct impact on other aspects of society, and whether businesses are open or closed, or whether the numbers are increasing or decreasing. Our expertise and our knowledge was education and knowledge of students. So the endeavour, which is one of our pillars, to directly and then indirectly check in every day through some data, some informal evidence, whether students are turning their cameras on, whether they're responding, whether they're submitting work, daily attendance check-ins every single session, that ongoing check-in with students at risk. So by the time we came back, we had a greater awareness and we developed a stronger partnership and relationship. And what we noticed upon return is that our younger students, so our year 7s, were ready to go, were much more prepared to return, whereas our year 12s were suffering. So we engaged in a research-based partnership with Smiley Minds and other organisations around mindfulness practices for year 12, 11 students, their teachers and their families.
Fantastic. We'll get you to talk a little bit more about that later, Frank, too, when we talk about how you supported students on the return to school. But Jodie, I want to give you a chance to talk about the return to school sites at Sunshine College and how you might be identifying students at risk of disengagement now. I know you had a lot of contact with students as well, like the others on the call today, heaps of contact during remote learning in terms of phone calls, social media, and trying to understand actual engagement in learning, which we're hearing is a bit of a theme so far. So did all that help identify who was at risk, or did you use different things once students returned to school sites?
In the beginning, like everybody else, we sort of mobilised to get our teachers to make even stronger relationships with our students. And that meant when they came back, we had great relationships where we could talk to them about why didn't you engage with learning or throughout the process, and try and really understand what it was, as opposed to I just didn't want to participate. And we found that using things like our Instagram, and we used, so instead of doing Zoom classes, we gave students different sets of work, more family challenges sometimes, you know, go out and explore things, take a couple of pictures of things out, and what does sunlight mean to you, or what does autumn or spring mean to you? And we found, because a lot of our students had limited access to devices and internet and so forth, this was a much less threatening form of educational engagement for them. So they really enjoyed that more. They didn't have to be in front of a camera all day and perform in front of their classmates and give answers and feel quite vulnerable. So they felt that this was, you know, more engaging, I guess, for those students. So the students who were less engaged were the students who had struggled with their work and so forth. So we, you know, put in that first round of lockdown for us, we tried to get a lot more work happening. But once we moved to that second round of lockdown, we'd sort of taken some of that feedback from students and thought, let's prioritise student health and wellbeing, and the same as our staff as well, and not focus so much on learning, because we know once the students come back to us and we've got a caring and safe environment with all the bells and whistles, we can get that learning happening again. But we didn't want to lose students, we didn't want to disengage them, because then it's harder to get them back into education after that second wave of lockdown.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll talk a little bit more about your Instagram channels later in this conversation. You guys went above and beyond as well in terms of keeping that engagement going.
Yep, definitely.
Well, since I've teased it so many times now, we will move on to start talking about taking action. I know there was a few questions about this. And what I will say is, unfortunately, the evidence is not as strong when you're talking about taking action to support students as it is on the predictors of disengagement. As you all know, it's very complex. Some of the children are very complex, and the young people, in terms of supporting their needs to keep them engaged in school, it's much easier to identify the predictors. And there's just been more research done in that space. So the evidence that we do have in the literature review talks about how that you can implement dropout prevention programs. A lot of the US is from the States, so dropout is the US terminology. So these programs can successfully reduce disengagement, and a lot of the programs are more successful if they're holistic in their nature. But in terms of the individual things that you need in the program, there's not enough research on that. But what we can share, and we have shared in the paper, is Evidence for Learning has some evidence-based strategies that you can draw on for specific topics that are related to remote learning or the return to school site. So things like remote learning, metacognition and self-regulation, parental engagement, and student health and wellbeing. That's been a really popular systematic literature review that was just released in the last few weeks. Which is really relevant right now. As Jody indicated, a lot of schools are focusing on student health and wellbeing. So all the links to all this information will be shared after the webinar and on the last slide of the webinar. So we'll get that information to you if you don't have it already. So let's keep going to the panel, and I'm going to start off with Michael at WODONGA Senior Secondary College, who has a lovely graphic in terms of all the things that they did during remote learning to support students. So do you want to talk a bit, Michael, about what you did in remote learning and what you're doing now on the transition back to school to support students?
Thanks, Danielle. Yes, certainly. So early in our remote learning journey, we really took a step back and looked at what all the different roles we were fulfilling as a school and all the different needs that students were having. You know, we started with bushfires at the start of the year as well, so we were aware that people weren't travelling that great in January, let alone in later on in the year. And we really stepped back to look at all the different needs that students might have in remote learning and develop this this mental map, I guess, that we used. And it really became a very important touch point in all the things we were doing. How were they supporting all these aspects of student needs? Because whilst we're there for academic learning growth and allowing our students to engage with their learning and go onto a pathway, particularly being a senior college, we also have a range of other things we're fulfilling for students. So that really shaped our program in remote learning. We cut by more than half the amount of face-to-face time that you'd have, online face-to-face time that students and teachers had, made space in the week for physical health and wellbeing, for students to have a bit more flexibility so that they could take care and balance other needs in their life, recognising that some students would be caring for siblings, helping siblings to remote learn, being older students and having younger siblings, many of them working, earning an income as well, because they may be still getting shifts at the supermarket when their parents aren't. So recognising all those things really shaped our work in remote learning. And one thing in particular we did was to instigate a really comprehensive program, as everyone else has discussed similar things, around checking in with students and parents. And we also had a program for checking in with staff, with the executive staff at the school, checking in with staff to make sure we were monitoring and tracking, I guess, that complete picture. We also did some tracking around just general engagement and well-being, and some sort of pulse surveys that we continued, particularly during the latter part of what we like to call remote learning version 2. And that was really helpful for identifying how everyone was travelling and for managing that transition back. And look, we've kept, it says student needs in remote learning, but we've kept that model in place as an important touch point as we come back onto site, and really looking to put things in place to ensure that students can have that connectedness and that engagement. Obviously, we're doing many things at school to be COVID safe, which changes the way the school operates. It changes the social dimension of the schooling, and has changed things we've had to put in place in terms of the physical things we can do. And also things like that, recognising that in that transition, for many students, the feeling of safety and security at school also required us to be really upfront about how we were being COVID safe, and we had things managed and we had processes in place, and it was all, it was all going to be well with them returning onto site. And yeah, look, it's really been a great journey this year for us. And, we've been doing, we started the year with a focus on doing some work on metacognition and self-regulation, which really have continued to be important throughout this journey. And what it's shown to us is our students being a disengaged or a disadvantaged cohort prone to disengagement, they have continued to engage through remote learning quite well. Many students, as mentioned before, perhaps for some students at least, it was a better environment for them. They engaged more. But really what our students have shown, and the focus our teachers have had there, is that the ability to focus on metacognition and self-regulation. Students can take ownership and they can take responsibility, even when they're disadvantaged, and with the right supports from their teachers. So yeah, this has really informed our work, and it continues to throughout the rest of this year as we navigate all the different things. And I suppose the next step ahead is to look at what supports need to be put in place as we go through putting in place various programs for next year to ensure that everyone remains on an equal footing and isn't disadvantaged.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michael. I love how thoughtful you are about the plan, and you've got this device that I've seen in a few different places now, the device in terms of the graphic, so you can communicate clearly with your own community as well as others more broadly what you're focusing on and why.
Yeah, thank you.
So, Donna, I'll just turn to you. You've done a few fun things at Western Port on the initial transition back to school sites, one which had my 8-year-old nephew wanting to go to Western Port Secondary College. So do you want to talk very briefly about that, and then I'll ask you about another big initiative you have in place?
Sure. I guess our focus for students returning to school was, in actual fact, the first priority was just getting them back. And so we really wanted to focus on bringing some kind of joy and excitement back to that return, both to staff and to students, whilst I guess also acknowledging the real anxiety that a lot of our community had about returning to school, not just in that first wave, but in the second. And that there were some triggers for both our staff and students. So our aim was to get people back on site in a positive way. And so I think you're making reference to our food vans and laser tag, which was the first opportunity that we had, which was with both, I guess, staff and students. But that really was also precursed by care packages that we had set up for not just our staff, but all of our senior students and some of our junior students. So we hand delivered a care package to every student in year 10, year 11 and year 12, which is not an easy feat if you can imagine that many students at a senior secondary school. We backed that off with pizza and trivia nights. So in between each of the waves, we had Parents and Friends Association pay for and support us to have pizzas delivered. And it wasn't our idea, we stole it from Instagram, but it was more about making it really clear that while we couldn't be with students, we wanted to be with them, we wanted to know they were connected. And then when they came back on site, it was about welcoming activities and celebration to be back with us. So yeah, they were the main parts, I guess. Did you want me, Danielle, just to keep talking about the other priorities, I guess, about getting our students back to school?
Yeah,
sure.
please do.
Look, we included, once they were back on site, a real focus on mindfulness and meditation sessions, both for staff and for students. And those ICT check-ins, I know Danielle mentioned earlier, we had about 60% of our student cohort that didn't have devices, which we ended up being able to supply through State School Relief and through our internal loans. But we're talking about, 350 to 380 devices that we were loaning and organising, which is a large amount and a lot of logistics. And we did check-ins on all of those students, whether they had a loan device or one of their own. We were really mindful that there might be an inevitable second wave in that first instance, which there was. And we did want to make sure that our senior students in particular, our Year 12s, weren't going to be hindered any further if the second wave hit. So we did a lot of ICT check-in and lab sessions. And then more recently, I guess, on the second wave return, we ran a celebration of Happy 18th for all of our Year 12 students who had missed out on their 18th birthday. So it was very old school 80s cake and cordial and and party games, but they loved it because they just missed out on so much. And then I guess in terms of the school focus, we modified our timetables to keep that remote flexible learning half, some on site, some not, with some independent study and health sessions. And we continued the home group structure to build the relationships and keep those community links. And then I guess our second priority, once we got them back, was to focus on that triage list that I spoke about earlier, which was about setting up some really imperative student support group meetings. We updated our individual educational plans. We did some testing, covertly in some cases, but we did testing, and we ran catch-up sessions, and we reset goals with our students so that they were achievable. And they weren't asked to do every piece of work that they'd missed in remote learning, because for some students that was their fear about coming back. They hadn't engaged as well as they could have, or other students did, and they were terrified about what they were going to come back to. And then we threw out half of our term 4 curriculum and we readjusted it, and we included as much hands-on learning and practical activities as humanly possible. And so that's kind of what we did from our senior school setting. And then I know that we've got quite a few primary schools linked, so I might just spend a minute or so just talking about the continued work that we have done with our feeder primary schools on our early literacy intervention and the transition to high school, which is probably going to be the most difficult that we have ever had or we've ever faced at the moment. So Western Port really believes in that cradle to tertiary approach, which was based on some SVA supported research a couple of years ago around that Harlem Children's Zone cradle to college model. And it really is looking at that best practice approach to support students who are experiencing vulnerability. And we work closely with several of our feeder primary schools to kind of support that vision and to engage with them in our school. So we're committed to what we call our learning guarantee, which is to support more students to achieve the at grade level by the time they end Year 9. So once they're moving into our senior program, we want to ensure that they've got that best opportunity to actually transition into senior school and then a meaningful pathway after that. And so what we do through that learning guarantee with our feeder primary schools is we need to engage in parents at a grade 4 level, and we ask them to sign up to our process. We have Year 4 students that are in our partnership that we ask those students to complete nationally benchmarked online assessment literacy and numeracy tests, which are run by us. We then ask our staff to visit the schools that we work in consultation with, and we provide a teacher to give relief time to the primary school teachers to help them to plan for their learning interventions and for whatever additional supports or learning needs they need based on those online assessments that we've done in consultation with the primary schools. And then we still focus on our community approach, because it really is about, probably now more than ever, making sure that all of our young people, regardless of whether they're currently at primary school going to be ours or whether they're ours already, is that we can continue to engage them now that remote learning has hopefully finished forever. Fingers crossed.
Thank you, Donna. I'm a big fan of the Learning Guarantee project, as you know, and I think it's a very innovative way to work with feeder primary schools, and it's directly linked to the evidence that academic achievement is a strong predictor of disengagement, and we know literacy intervention needs to start early. We had some questions for this webinar about the link between learning difficulties and disengagement. So I think what Western Port are doing is a really interesting example of a secondary school too, doing an interesting partnership with their feeder primary schools in terms of literacy intervention. So Gail and Trish, I know you spend a lot of time building relationships between students and teachers and the schools and families this year. I think, Gail, you said it's the best communication you've had in your long career, many, many decades of career. So I wanted you to talk to a little bit about what you've been doing in terms of the return to school sites and how that communication still going, how you're working with families now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Danielle. So I believe, well, we know that it's similar to, I think it was WODONGA, having a look at the communication and the way we've tracked our data with our parents and communication. That daily communication has absolutely been essential, and it's had a really positive impact, not only for staff, students, but the parents as well. The return to school has been, like all schools, we've had good and bad days, and different people, you know, are going really well. Like even staff, we were quite concerned about staff returning, you know, on site. So we have 3 sectors here. So we had staff who really didn't leave because they're in inclusive ed. We had primary staff who were then doing on-site supervision, and we had secondary teachers that really were home for the, you know, the majority of both lockdowns. So our keeping that going has been probably a little bit more problematic, because I think the parents have just been, they're tired and they didn't ask for this to happen, but the confidence for them to contact us and us to contact them is actually at a very high level. So the support, you know, it's the old onion, the layers around the child. It's so tight and is so positive, but it's actually quite efficient and working really well. We learned a lot about our families, and they learned a lot about the staff. So the increased commitment from not only our families but our staff has been really observable. And we also take a little bit of credit. We believe that as we are part of our community, because of that commitment and that continual check-in that really is going, we haven't stopped it, is the family violence rates for Seymour in regard to the Mitchell Shire LGA, ours actually decreased. So I think it's around that level of safety, and I know we had the safety on Michael's slide, and probably sitting here looking at all those little, you know, the segmented parts. The challenge for us is how we keep that going and really front and centre. So Trish might just want to explain a little bit around, we actually have quite specific steps and routines that are literally pinned on the fridge that we never ever gave them before. And also about, I think, I'm not quite sure what other principals have and staff have seen, but staff, because we work every day, we're like a fish out of water. I don't have my classroom, I don't have time to prepare. So really we just had those daily briefings, and it was really, for me, is just to see everyone's face on the screen and double check that people were actually travelling as well as they could. So Trish might want to just expand on that, because we did that with our families as well.
Just on return, I work closely with the year level coordinators in the secondary area. I asked them all to have at least one WebEx or full, almost like a year level assembly, and go through, you know, the routines, what's going to happen, the new rules around drink taps, all of those sorts of things. But in particular, I joined the WebEx for Year 8s often, and the year level coordinators, they had that wellbeing check-in with all of their kids, and it was really well received by every Friday. And so they've continued with some really, really good positive relationships with their students. And then using our WebEx system on return, instead of having the whole school assemblies, which we aren't allowed to have, not even year level assemblies, we'd have just like this, but all of the students would be able to log in via their teachers' link to the WebEx. So we've had quite a few of those, return to school WebExes, so that students are, well prepared around routines and so on. And I think we're getting there.
Yeah, so I think the importance too with our senior students is that careers and pathways discussions. So they've been, would happen anyway, like it's business as usual. But for those students who we've been quite concerned about, our careers team have even, including the parents, because the parents are in the background at home, they're there. For those that are a little bit reluctant to return, so it's just increasing their confidence to return and the purpose of coming to school, what are their goals and aspirations and dreams. So getting those verbalised again has been really important. You probably know that careers and pathways planning is important, but this was probably the most that we've observed in getting those students to return. There was a bit of a honeymoon period this time. Everyone wanted to see each other and it was just a beautiful vibe, even, a shame that the parents couldn't come in, but lovely to see the parents at the fences. But we wondered how long that would last, and it has been fairly okay. But again, the children or the students that probably would have been a little bit bumpy along the ride are the ones that we've really hooked into to keep coming back in to have those discussions. And the word differentiation, I'd be very surprised if there's any teacher in the state that doesn't know what it looks like, feels like, and smells like. That has been, and collaboration. Without the staff have had to do authentic collaboration. And there's been a real purpose for it because it works, and the kids have been really hooked in and engaged. So it's just a matter, as you say, that hasn't stopped, it's continuing. But we need to ensure that that's a high priority because it's what matters most and what works for us here at Seymour.
And fantastic. Thank you, Gail and Trish, so much there. And I will particularly note we did have a question in advance of this webinar about the link between engagement and careers planning. So thank you for covering that. I'm going to switch to Jodie now at Sunshine College. So Jodie, I'm going to ask you two questions. The first one is, you did a lot of communication as well, or Sunshine College did, during remote and flexible learning. Your Instagram Sunny Foods channel is quite famous, actually. I think even some TV media coverage of it. I've even tuned in a few times. So are you using those new channels now on the return to school is the first question. And the second one is in relation specifically to a cohort. We had this question in advance of the webinar as well. Sunshine College has about 1,100 students, but a large population of language background other than English. So we had a particular question about what has this meant in terms of engagement in school for students from a refugee background. So they're the two questions I'd love you to chat about.
Okay, brilliant. In terms of maintaining our Instagram fame and keeping that going, so our wonderful food technology teacher would do things like cooking demonstrations and still having that interactions with students. She even, as we all know now, people are sharing their families, so her mum would come along and help cook with her. And the kids really loved seeing that, seeing, Miss Barker and her mum, and then the students would then cook try and replicate some of the recipes themselves and share those pictures on Instagram. And so we're still moving in towards that direction because it's a really instantaneous way, but it also allows students to see teachers as humans and see us doing things other than, bookwork and learning. So we're definitely doing that and keeping that running. And we've got on our new campus, which we built a new school and it was opened in June and we couldn't put any kids into it. And so we had to wait another few months to do that. So that's all up and running now, but we've got TVs around the school that can stream that sort of programming and that. So the kids are still getting really all of that sort of engagement and connection, even though they're at the school now. In terms of EAL communities or refugee communities, they are some of our most vulnerable communities and in a global pandemic or even with education. And for us, it was just really essential that we maintained those relationships. And for us, we don't just build relationships with our students, we build them with their whole family. So getting to know the parents and being able to communicate with them and mobilising groups of people to wrap around that support for those families was really important for us. But I think when we looked at the work and the way we were interacting with our students, it really supported families who English was a second language, because again, it wasn't that, you know, students weren't doing that heavy-ended, we don't have textbooks in our school, and they're not doing those really lengthy Zoom classes where the kids have to perform and hand in all this, you know, heavy work. Lots of our interactions were one-to-one interactions on phone calls, or we'd go out and, you know, drop things at families' houses just like everybody else and have a quick little distanced communication with them. So it was really building those relationships and making students feeling safe, that they didn't have to get up and do a Zoom class for 4 or 5 hours. And again, like many of you, our families didn't have that technology available to them because they are vulnerable communities. It was important for us to make those connections, because lots of the families who are refugee families don't have other family here as well. So they were very isolated. So where the rest of us could maybe walk and hopefully interact with people who spoke our own language, for some of these families, they didn't have that outside communication with anybody. So they felt even more isolated. So really just setting up ways to, you know, keep supporting those families and always being there, and letting them, when they needed something, sort of come down, and we'd speak to them outside the school grounds and just offer any support we possibly could to those families. So we were very conscious of that, as we were with all of our families.
Fantastic, really well put, Jodie. Now, I've got one more formal question left, or maybe one or two, but while I'm doing that, we'll probably have a few minutes left before we have to close at 6 p.m. So if you want to start entering any questions that you do have that have come from the discussion this evening, please feel free to do so in the chat. Susanna will help curate those. But before we hand to the chat box for open questions, I'm going to ask Frank, as a last kind of formal comment. You mentioned in our interview for this project that it's the principal's job to make sure processes and systems are in place, which sort of sums up the paper in one sentence. So do you want to share some of the systems and processes that you use at Footscray Grey High to support at-risk students, including you did a lot of work on roles and responsibilities, documentation, feedback systems and surveys.
Yeah.
So anything you did during remote learning and you're going to keep in place going forward?
Yeah, and look, it sounds a little bit harsh, and the idea is that we continue doing the work, and that's the work that we did prior to going remote, and then during remote with our continuation of learning plan. It's this idea of ongoing reflection, ongoing implementation, reflection, renewal. You know, so one of the things that we did really well, and I'm hearing other schools have done as well, is real feedback. So not waiting for system feedback, getting live daily, weekly feedback to inform our teaching and learning, to inform our relationships, to inform our approach to to community. So that's something that I would say, and I do see that as a principal's responsibility to have that balcony view, as we often hear, to be able to have a look at what's happening in the community, and to understand the pulse, and to put the resources in place to support ongoing improvement and growth within our schools.
Yeah, fantastic. Well said, Frank. I think that's incredibly important, and that's something I noticed across all the schools involved in this project, of just how reflective they were, how much data they collected, how much they were willing to continuously improve and do things better in what has been an incredibly tough year for everyone, but in particular educators. So we've got a few questions rolling in. While we're creating those, I'm going to ask one more that we got in advance of the session. This is the last one I think we haven't covered yet. And that's just, Frank, I think I'll direct this to you, but the link between disengagement and students that have difficulties coming to school. So that might be because of bullying, because of autism, because of learning difficulties, because of violence. So do you have any reflections on that link?
Yeah, the same answer, human connection, awareness, partnerships and relationships, and that is paramount whether we're at school, remote, or returning from remote. It's really working in genuine collaboration with feeder schools, with external services, with parents, with students, and checking in, and this idea that healthy, happy people do better. You know, so we knew that there was going to be some students that would struggle returning. So as a lot of people have said on this in this seminar, that human connection has just been the key. So yes, all schools have disengaged students, you know, with disability students, with anxiety students that don't want to come. So that awareness and that belief at the professional level that we make a difference. You know, so what some of my colleagues have said, you know, that human touch of visiting, sending care packages, being aware, making phone calls, they're the moments that young people and families don't forget, and they'll remember as important relationships and connections between home and school.
Yeah, well put, Frank. Susanna, there's a few questions rolling in. Did you want to pick the one or two that we might have time to answer?
Terrific. Thanks, Danny. There's a couple of terrific questions there. Some of them I'll leave for the panel to talk about afterwards, perhaps, but a really great question from Sally around the potential of engaging community members, so volunteers or mentors to assist with school or assist your schools, and this is an open question, not directed to anyone in particular, in sustaining the work of student and parental engagement. Is there a role for that, or do you see potential in engaging those types of people in your schools?
Who would like to have an answer at that?
I can.
Excellent, thank you.
Not specifically volunteers, but one of the things that we did that became apparent was we needed to work with all of our systems. And so one of the systems that I work closely with was the Navigator program. So we put more students on Navigator because that gave us outreach workers. And they're the people that actually, they weren't allowed to go into the family homes or anything, but I had an extra set of eyes and an extra more reaching out to families that the students were either previously disengaged or they were disengaging more and more as time went on. And that has also been very, very important in the students returning to school as well, because now they're able to meet them on site and assist them to build up their hours back on campus. So not necessarily volunteers, but yeah, Navigator program, and also organisations like Salvo Care, Anglicare were also involved with some of our most vulnerable families and assisted us to get them sorted.
Fantastic. Does someone else want to chime in, or we'll go to the next question? Okay, next question.
So one more here, and this is from Katrina, and she was asking around cohorts of at-risk students who might have done better in terms of their engagement and well-being and academic outcomes during COVID. I think we've heard a lot of anecdotes about that, but does anyone care to comment?
I might take that one if that's all right. I guess very similar to what Trish and Gail were talking about, Western Port runs our own outreach program. So we already have a direct link, I guess, from Navigator who refer to us, or us to Navigator if all of our plethora of things still haven't worked. But what we, I know I'm going to lose my train of thought when I'm discussing this. Can you remind me what the last part of the question is?
Sure thing. So it was really about those students who were
thank you. Yep.
Enjoyed the experience or got a lot out of it.
Thanks, Susan. It's been a very long day. So thank you for that. I think we had quite a few students who did exceptionally well in remote learning and who has attendance improved by some, 100% in some cases, who had never engaged or who were unwilling to engage before COVID hit, to some that had just increased their attendance to 100%. And that the plan now is to look at how we can take what we have learned from remote learning and how we can actually entwine it into our outreach program or into some of our other our other initiatives so that we can take that real innovation that we were forced to generate and work out how we can still run some kind of interactive, remote, in some cases, learning to keep those young people engaged, if that is the appropriate pathway for the young person. And if it's really clear that we can't get them back on site, then we would much prefer to design a program that will continue to allow them to gain a qualification and to actually improve that outcome for a young person and their pathway. So I think that in a nutshell is the work that we will take next, because that's the really exciting part for us. There's so much innovation and there's so much now room for, well, why can't we do this? Why couldn't we do this? And we will ask for forgiveness, not permission. And we're going to have a crack.
I think that's an excellent note to end on in terms of a hopeful look for the future and to innovate and to continuously improve. So we're right on time. So I want to thank our school leaders. Thank you very, very much for giving up your time, both for this project, to share your expertise and knowledge, both during the research part of this project and this evening. We really appreciate it. You've done a fantastic job this year. For everyone else, thank you so much for joining us as well and giving up your time to learn a little bit more. There is a quick survey after this. It only takes a minute if you'd like to feed that back to us about what you find useful, what other webinars you would like. I'm sharing the details of how to get in touch. If you didn't get your question answered and you'd like it to get it answered, please contact us. We're happy to follow up with you, and we'll send links around to all the resources we mentioned in an email following this webinar. Please don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook if you want to keep in touch and find out more information about our upcoming evidence webinars and resources. But again, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your term.